In Hinduism, if you look at it, there are four specific eternal principles that define the philosophy of the entire religion. The very first is the essence of the Vedas. In the Rig Veda, which is considered to be one of the most holiest in the entire Hinduism, we have a Purush Sukta hymn, which very categorically mentions the four Varnas. But if you look at the original version of the Vedas and not any translation or interpretation of the Vedas, you will understand one very peculiar thing, that these four Varnas are mentioned as abstract categories and not a hierarchy. What we mean by that is that the Vedas very clearly argue that whenever there is a Varna, it is not a hierarchy. The Brahman, Kshatriya, Shudra, and Vaishya are not four hierarchies, but rather they are abstract groups which you get or acquire on the basis of your own quality, on the basis of your own learning and your innate ability. That is why you see there is always a misconception when you use a terminology or a phrase like that Brahmins are intellectuals. When you say that Brahmins are intellectuals, it appears that the Brahmins have got some kind of an entitlement by being a Brahman. That is not so. The Varnas never advocate that. The Varnas very categorically say that a Brahman is a person who by his innate ability can acquire intellect, and as a result of which such a person can become an intellectual. So rather than saying that Brahmins are intellectuals, the Vedas would rather say an intellectual is Brahman. So this is the difference, and that is the reason why Swami Vivekananda used to always argue throughout his life that everyone should become and strive to become a Brahman. Because for him, the word Brahman meant that a person who is an ideal person. So one thing is very clear. Vedas do not argue for what is called as a hierarchical Varna system. The second internal principle of the Sanatan Dharma or the Hinduism is the concept of Jati. Jati comes from the concept of Janam. Janam means the birth. Initially, people used to live together in a group of villages, and those people living together in a group of villages constituted a Jati. But because in the ancient times people were living in a same village, they also started doing similar kind of occupations. When they did similar occupations, the Jati term now became vocational or occupational. And as Jati became occupational, it remained so with a sense of belonging of people within the same community. One very peculiar thing is that even today, the term Jati, which is often known as a Biradri, is nothing but a group of people having a similar conduct of life. So, Jati is a system that evolved within the larger umbrella of the Varnas, and that's why we call it as the Varna Jati. The third important eternal principle about Hinduism is the concept of religion. It's very important to know that the Sanatan Dharma religion is completely decoupled from the society. That means that in Sanatan Dharma, everyone can worship everyone. There are different gods. You can worship them your way. Whether you are a rich man, poor man, it doesn't matter. The God remains same for you. You can worship gods in your own ways. If you are a rich, you can worship the God in a different way. If you are a poor, you can worship the God in your way. And this itself is the essence of multicultural practice within the entire Sanatan Dharma, which is a part since the ancient times. The fourth and the most important concept of Sanatan Dharma is it's a completely decentralized religion or a way of life. When we say it is decentralized, it means that today in Sanatan Dharma, we don't have a clergy. We don't have any kind of a church like institution, which is a centralized authority that propagates what ought to be done by the Hindus. The Hindus can live the way of life the way they want to live. And that is the reason why all activities are based on the concept and surrounded by dharma. They are driven by dharma. If there is a dispute at the village level, the villagers resolve it. If there is a dispute at the familial level, families elder members resolve it. So we don't have a centralized dispute settlement body. We don't have a centralized clergy type institution that is here to give you the tenets of religion on a day to day basis. This decentralized character makes the Sanatan Dharam highly flexible, highly mobile, and not compartmentalized. Now, the problem began when Islamic invaders invaded India. When they invaded India at that time, what started happening was that the first focus of the Islamic invaders was that they wanted to snatch away the lands of the Hindus. And when they started snatching the land of the Hindus, they consequently started snatching away Hindu women. In order to protect the Hindu women at that time from these Islamic invaders, the Hindus adopted the practice of child marriage. Please understand that the child marriage as a practice, not that we support it, but it originated at a time in a context to protect the Hindu woman. Because if you marry a Hindu girl at a smaller age, then at least this kind of a prey, who is basically an Islamic invader, will not look at the woman in the same way. And it is during this time period only when we saw the rise of another important social practice, which was basically a practice called the practice of basically dowry. Why this dowry practice started at that time is again primarily because if a groom is able to provide money to protect the woman, he will take care of the woman and protect the woman from an Islamic invader in a more aggressive manner. But as the Islamic invaders invaded India, snatched away the lands of the Hindus, most of the Hindus who were living in the urban areas at that time, they were forced to go to the villages. And many of the villages now started becoming overpopulated. And when the villages became overpopulated, they could not sustain the incoming flow of Hindus from the urban areas. And consequently, some of the Hindus had to leave the villages also and live in the forests. Now, the problem is, those Hindus who were living in the forests at that time, they were already deprived of their land, deprived of their possessions, of their money, because all of them was looted by these Islamic invaders. The problem got aggravated that when these Hindus who were pushed to the margins of forests, when they started living in the forest, they started contracting a lot of diseases because these Hindus were never at that time knowing what diseases could probably occur because they always lived in the urban areas. Now, when in the forest areas they started getting these diseases, it became a cause of concern. Why? Because most of the trade during the medieval times used to pass through the forest areas. Big trading caravans used to pass through the forests. As a result of which, when these Hindus living in the forests found that they are infected with infectious diseases, they started limiting their interactions with these trading caravans. They thought that because we are sick, we don't want to pass our disease to these trading caravans who may be going from one place to the other. And as a result of which, they stopped taking food from these trading caravans, they stopped taking water from them, and started secluding them. As they started secluding themselves, this led to the rise of a class of people known as the untouchables. And see, this is important. Why? Because when the Britishers come later, they classify these people as the part of the fifth Varna, saying that these are untouchables whom nobody wants to touch. But the question is, why were they untouchables? Not because they were designated by somebody, but because they wanted, as part of the eternal practice of the Sanatan Dharam, not to poison somebody just because you are basically sick today. This is what the Britishers could never understand, and they played politics over it. And thereby came the untouchable category, so called, in our country. So, one thing is very clear: Islamic invaders were responsible for the Hindu Holocaust. 8 lakh Hindus had lost their lives, approximately, as per various estimates that are available today. And more importantly, Hindus had to become untouchables for the larger benefit of the humanity, a certain segment of them, so that they do not pass on the diseases to the others. The problem happened when the Portuguese came to India. When the Portuguese came to India, specifically when Vasco da Gama came as a trader, the Portuguese at that time stationed one of their officers by the name of Duarte Barbosa. Duarte Barbosa was an India officer of the Portuguese. He was stationed by the Portuguese in India. He was asked by the Portuguese government to basically investigate the Indian society, identify the trade opportunities. Barbosa, when he started touring different segments of the Indian country, he found that in India, people are divided into different kind of varnas and jatis, a practice that we had been following since the ancient times. But because the Portuguese could never understand what these varnas and jatis are, Barbosa started writing reports by saying that India is divided into various caste groups. Now, this is again important because this is the first time somebody began to use the concept of caste, and specifically in the Indian context when the word was completely alien to India. And second important reason why it is crucial is because the word caste was attributed by the Portuguese to the different varnas and jatis. That means that the Portuguese, who could not comprehend the concept of varna jati, began to confuse them with the different castes. 150 years after Barbosa came another important person whose name was basically a French traveler who was Jean Baptiste Travenier. Travenier again was a traveler in India. He traveled to different parts of the country. He also wrote his travelogue. And you know what he wrote in his travelogue? He said that India is divided into 72 different castes. But these 72 castes owe their origin from the four principal castes, that is the Brahman, Kshatriya, Shudra, Vaishya. See the problem. The Portuguese and the French, who could not comprehend the Indian society, did not understand the eternal principles of Sanatan Dharam, did not understand the Jati Varna. They tried to conflate and confuse the Jati Varna with the larger caste narrative and started using the word caste for them. So let's be very clear at this onset in the beginning here that the word caste is not something that is Indian in nature. It is an imported terminology imposed upon the Indian society. We'll investigate it further ahead now. Now, when the Britishers were there in India, after 1757 Battle of Plassey, what happened is that the Britishers adopted an expansionist attitude. At that time, they were continuously expanding their control over Bengal, Bihar, Odisha, different other territories. But the Britishers were also doing another thing. They also simultaneously, while they were expanding their control, kept on looking for translation of different scriptural texts in India, and that too scriptural texts that were associated with Hinduism. In 1792, one silk merchant by the name of Charles Grant, he was touring India, he was doing trade with India, but he found a lot of difficulty in doing trade with India because he always had a confusion that why these Indians are so against killing of animals for the purpose of trade. This is an eternal principle of Sanatan Dharam that we do not cause harm to anybody else in the process of harming anybody else, and that too for the purpose of trade. So, as a result of which, what started happening was that Charles Grant, who was a big businessman, he got very irritated. He started telling the court of directors of the East India Company that British should try to basically interfere into the social and religious practices of the Indians. We must try to make sure that these people are now more modern and don't follow these regressive religious practices where they don't want to harm an animal for the purpose of trade. And Charles Grant also found another friend who supported this idea, who was a British social reformer whose name was Charles Wilberforce. So, Charles Grant and Charles Wilberforce collectively pressurized the British government at that time to allow the East India Company the right to interfere into the socio religious practices of the Indians with the larger attempt to modernize them. They succeeded in 1813 when the British passed the Charter Act 1813. The 1813 Charter Act is something that allowed the East India Company officials to officially interfere into the socio religious practices of the Indians, that designated them as backward and try and attempt to modernize or westernize them. The thing did not stop here. In 1794, one of the officials associated with the East India Company, his name was William Jones. William Jones is a person who went on to identify a text called Manusmriti. He translated Manusmriti, interpreted it in his own language, in his own way, because obviously he was neither an expert in Sanskrit nor expert in socio political history. So he just, in an isolated manner, translated the text and then began to create a narrative. The narrative was that I have found a text which is the divine text of the Hindus, which explains every divine aspect of the Hinduism. And he began to say that this text also explains that why Hindus are so backward. He did not stop here. He went on to argue that Hindu social practices and religious practices are also backward, and they are all sanctioned by Manusmriti. But in 1857, we had a revolt. After the revolt, there was a transfer of power to the British Crown. Now, when the British Crown took over, they said that the East India Company, being a commercial company, will not undertake any kind of political activity in India. All politics will now be done by the British government. So, British government now needed officials. They could have recruited the Muslims in India. They could have recruited the Hindus. Muslims never came forward. Muslims were still crying with the fact that how could our mighty Mughal empire got over. So because they were busy in crying, they could not understand what to do. Britishers chucked them over. They took over the Hindus. Hindus joined the British administration, began to work for them, began to work with them, worked very effectively. When the Britishers found that Hindus are a good intellectual class to work with, this is the time the Britishers started to realize that we must convert these Hindus into Christianity. They tried, they failed. Then they started telling these Hindus in the administration that your religious practices are basically old, archaic, leave them. Hindus revolted, they rejected the British logic, again the British failed. So when the British failed, they were now in a dilemma. The dilemma was that we want a class of Hindus who are basically subservient to the British, who are Christian in outlook, and also who are basically tastefully British people. What do we do? So Britishers now started searching that in order to make sure that these Hindus basically adopt our practices, we have to do something. At that time in 1850s and 60s, in Europe, there was a big idea that was dominating the intellectual space, and that idea was called the Darwinism. Darwin had talked about in biology how survival of the fittest is crucial. The Europeans started applying that survival of the fittest of Darwin onto the social practices, and thus was born the idea of social Darwinism. They started saying that survival of the fittest is possible only if you are a Christian, because Christianity is a supreme religion where every Christian is basically the fittest Christian. So, survival in the society is only possible if you are a Christian. This particular social Darwinism thought of supremacy of Christianity was then used by the Christian missionaries to convert people into India. Now, as this practice was happening, the Britishers also wanted to demonize Hinduism. But the problem was, whom do you demonize in Hinduism? How do you create a space amongst Hindus by convincing them that they have to convert for Christianity? You have to demonize the Hinduism, but in order to demonize Hinduism, you need something. You need one text to demonize. You see, Hindus, you have this text is wrong, so we demonize it. You follow Christianity. Problem in Hinduism was there was no single text. Hinduism, as I said, has a diversity when it comes to religion. You have different texts, you use them in different contexts, you use them as per your convenience. So, scripturally, they could not find one text. Second problem was that they could not even find in Hinduism an authority like clergy, because during the time of European Renaissance and Reformation, and specifically Reformation in Europe, the clergy or the church was at the target. Now, in Hinduism, there was no such clergy, there was no such institution or authority like church. So, again, there was a problem. It is in this backdrop of larger confusion for the British that they decided that we are now going to create some theories to demonize Hinduism. The first theory that they created was to demonize the Brahmanical priest. What did the Britishers do? The Britishers used William Jones and his text, the translated version of Manusmriti. The Britishers used that text to argue very categorically that, see, Manusmriti says that caste is an essential practice of Hinduism. Firstly, the word caste in Manusmriti is nowhere mentioned. But the Britishers tried to create that narrative. That Manusmriti says that caste is an essential practice of Hinduism. This practice, the Britishers said, is accentuated by the Brahmanical priest. And the Brahmanical priest is a cunning man. He wants to basically support this caste because this helps him to basically acquire power. This helps him to assert his supremacy over other castes. And the Britishers did not stop here. They went on to say that the castes, as per Manusmriti, are nothing but the same as jatis and varnas. See the beauty. The jatis, varnas are conflated as caste. The jati, varnas conflated as caste are now attributed to Hinduism. They are also attributed to a cunning Brahman who has been created with the larger objective of asserting his supremacy through this. And now the problem is, they went on to say that as per Manusmriti, a person is designated his caste or given a caste at the time of his birth, and the person cannot change it. Firstly, there is nothing called as a caste. What they called as a caste was nothing but something very different called the Varna Jati. And Varna and Jati were both flexible, non compartmental. You could always have the mobility from one Varna to the other. But they said no. It is ascribed at birth, fixed at birth, cannot be changed. And on top of that, they began to say another crucial thing, that this caste system that has been created by the Brahmins does not promote merit. It has been created and designed with the larger objective of basically promoting only specific people by giving specific castes some supremacy. Why did the Britishers do this? They deliberately did this because they wanted, number one, within the Hinduism to demonize somebody, which they identified as the Brahman. And second thing is, when you demonize the Brahman using some religious scripture like a or a textual thing like a Manusmriti, then you are able to create a narrative amongst other Hindus who are other than the Brahmins that see, your suppressor, your oppressor is the Brahman. This way, you can atomize the society, break the society by dividing Hindus into two different groups or multiple groups. The second theory that the Britishers invented was the caste census. In 1872, when they carried out the very first census, they decided to classify Indian society into different castes. In the 1881 census, they decided to put different jatis now into the caste. And the final nail in the coffin was the 1901 census, whose commissioner was basically Herbert Risley. He prepared a 26-volume report where he imposed the Western race theory as the caste theory in India. In that 26-volume report which he prepared, he gave a big list of castes which he so called gathered from different segments of the society and said this is how the Indian society is divided into different castes. Let's understand one thing. There was no such thing called caste. In fact, when Risley's officials went down to the field to ask people different castes to which they belong, the people said, we don't know what you are asking. We don't even understand the word that you are speaking. We only know our jati. All the jatis were conflated into segments called castes. And why did the Britishers do this? Because the caste census and the Manusmriti narrative enabled the British to atomize the society, break the society, use one Hindu against the other Hindu. And such kind of a divided Hindu society played good for the British politics. When the country got independent in 1947, we had the so called left liberal narrative that came up. This left liberal narrative was built upon certain principles. The first was to create a class of Hindus in India which were called the so called secular Hindus. Now, who were the so called secular Hindus? They were those Hindus who would believe in two things. The first is they would not talk about the term Hindu Rashtra. Even though the population of the country constitutes 80% of the Hindus, Hindus today are demonized, prohibited to use the word Hindu Rashtra because if you use the word Hindu Rashtra, they may call you as a Hindu fanatic. So, this was a class that they wanted to create who would not talk about this. That's not all. The second thing that the secular Hindu would do is he would accept that there is a Brahmanical supremacy. He would accept that the Brahmanical supremacy is harmful for the Hindu society. He would accept that there is a need to demonize the Brahman. and he would accept that he belongs to a caste other than the Brahman, which is today suppressed by the Brahman. So the term secular Hindu was used to demonize and break the people. The term secular Hindu was used and created deliberately to ensure that a class of people is born who basically keep fighting amongst each other. The second element that came up was in the left liberal narrative is that these people started saying that the caste system in India is 3000 years old, it has never changed. Today, you pick up any book by any of these so called left liberals, they are found in plenty. Mostly HarperCollins and Penguin and other so called prominent publishers happen to publish their books because they are all British and they want to continue the same agenda and the same imperial outlook today. You pick up any of their books and you will be shocked to see that all of them mention the point that caste system in India is 3000 years old, which has never got changed. Ironically, 3000 years ago, the word caste never existed. The only term that was ever used was the Varna Jati. Caste was not even 300 years old. It was used for the first time by the Portuguese, then by the British, then by the French. Why do these people run their agenda today? Next important point is that they started saying that Dharma Shastras are the discriminatory texts. They sanction that caste system is regressive. Just like William Jones had identified Manusmriti as the so called divine text that basically supported all discrimination in India, these left liberals today have found the Dharma Shastras. For the left liberals, the Dharma Shastras today are apparently the texts which are akin to Manusmriti, and they are similar in their interpretation to what William Jones and others had argued. But the reality is, if you read the Dharma Shastras begin with the point. They begin with the point that these are texts which are personal opinions of the commentators in a certain historical setting. They may not tantamount to any engagement with the Sanatan Dharam Hinduism or subsequent times later. But this principle is completely omitted because these left liberals don't want to use it because it doesn't support their agenda. Then these people began to argue also that Vedas or the Vedic texts which are there, they are basically nothing but extension of Brahmanical greed. Why do they say that? Because obviously in the Vedas they don't want the population to know the truth. They have tried to poison the people of the country today by telling them that Varna is a hierarchy. The beauty is that Varna, as I said, is not a hierarchy. It is an abstraction of four categories. Based on your innate ability, you basically acquire the Varna. And more importantly, the Varna system as per the Veds are so flexible and so mobile that you may be in one Varna, but because of your innate ability, learning, and your IQ, you can shift to another Varna. Today, a Kshatriya can also do an intellectual activity what a Brahman may do, and a Brahman may also do, for that matter, trade what a Vaishya may do. But for these left liberals, it's not so. For them, Varna is a hierarchy. For them, Varna is rigid. For them, Varna is so rigid that it accentuates what is called as so-called discrimination. When all these narratives of the Britishers and their agents in the post-independent India, the so-called left liberals, had failed, these so-called left liberals have now adopted the same point again, what was adopted by the British in 1881, and that is again the caste census. The objective of the caste census is simple: atomize the society, break the consolidation of the Hindus. If the Hindus are consolidating, obviously consolidated Hindus are a problem. So break the Hindus into 10,000, 20,000 different castes, acquire power, and once you acquire power, then play one caste against the other. So for example, today, one thing is very clear. You talk about caste census, people will appreciate. You don't know what to do after you count the people. What has happened in Bihar? Bihar has done a caste census last year. What has happened after that? Has anybody who has been identified in the caste census got any benefit? You do not know. Nothing has happened. Today, there are people who are there on the YouTube who shout for the fact that caste census is imminent, caste census is the game of the future. Ask them this question next time. What happened in Bihar after the caste census? The report is available. We know which category has how much population, etc. Then what? Then nothing. It's just a manipulative tool. Now understand the next important thing. You use the caste census as a tool to grab power. Once you grab power, you count the castes. Let's say you counted the castes, and let's say there are 10,000 castes in India. Now, what do? Once you have atomized and broken down the society into 10,000 castes, you will continue to accentuate your power and keep that power by playing one caste against the other. If there is one caste that revolts, you give them some benefit. The moment you give them benefit, that caste becomes your political vote bank. Then, if somebody else revolts, you give them some benefits, they become your political vote bank. So, what is this entire tool of caste census? A tool to grab power, tool to sheerly break down the Indian society into different parts, keep them slaves forever, keep them dependent on the government forever, make sure that they never are able to grow out of it. And these people today who talk about so-called caste census idolize Ambedkar. Ironically, Baba Sahib Ambedkar was the man who talked about annihilation of the caste. And you are today doing a false attribution by saying that because Baba Sahib Ambedkar's views are there important for us, we want to basically do caste census. Boss, Baba Sahib Ambedkar said caste has to go. He advocated that caste system must be finished, smashed. And you want to do a caste census only to smash it? You want to use that caste census as a tool to grab power. It's nothing but an opportunistic tool to break down the society, enslave the society for the next 1000 years, keep them slaves like the Mughals did and the Britishers did, so that your power hegemony is maintained. I hope after this video, you will understand the importance of this foolish exercise that the people are advocating in this country, and also understand the fact that how harmful this is for the society, but beneficial only for a few people who have been thrown out of the power because of their sheer stupidity and corruption, for which they will never be able to return. Thank you.